الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الخلق سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وتابعين أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Dear respected people, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to another episode of an Ayah a day shows you the way. Today we are, subhanallah, at Juz 28, nearing the end very soon, subhanallah. And specifically we are going to be speaking about Surah Talaq. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Talaq, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها النبي إذا طلقتم النساء فطلقوهن لعدتهن وأحصوا العدة واتقوا الله ربكم لا تخرجوهن من بيوتهن ولا يخرجن إلا أن يأتين بفاحشة مبينة وتلك حدود الله ومن يتعد حدود الله فقد ظلم نفسه لا تدري لعل الله يحدث بعد ذلك أمرا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in translation, O Prophet, instruct the believers that if they are to divorce the women, if you are to divorce the women, فَطَلِّقُوهُنَّ لِعِدَّتِهِنَّ, then divorce them according to their iddah, i.e. make sure that their iddah has passed. وَأَحْصُوا الْعِدَّةِ, and count the iddah precisely. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ رَبَّكُمْ, and fear your Lord Allah. لَا تُخْرِجُوهُنَّ مِنْ بُيُوتِهِنَّ, and do not expel them from their homes. وَلَا يَخْرُجْنَ إِلَّا أَن يَأْتِينَ بِفَاحِشَةٍ مُبَيِّنَةٍ, and neither should they leave their homes unless they've committed a blatant crime, yani a bad sin. وَتِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ, and these are the limits of Allah. وَمَن يَتَعَدَّ حُدُودَ اللَّهِ فَقَدْ ظَلَمَ نَفْسَهُ, and the one who transgresses the limits of Allah has only wronged himself. لا تدري لعل الله يحدث بعد ذلك أمرا, you do not know, perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring about a matter, i.e. you may have a change of heart. This is what's meant here. A year or two ago, there was a case which occupied the social media space, news outlets, newspapers. Everyone was speaking about a specific case of divorce between an American couple who were very famous in the acting industry. And that couple was Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. This completely occupied, it was on YouTube streams, people were tuning in their thousands, millions, they were watching what was happening. Different cases were being brought forward, cases of abuse, cases of slander, physical abuse, all sorts of allegations were taking place. Now, what I want to focus on today isn't actually the idea of divorce, which what the ayah starts with. I want to focus and zoom in on one specific point in this ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ رَبَّكُمْ, and fear Allah your Lord. And then in the other ayah, in Surah Baqarah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also speaking about divorce, but in this case He's saying, فَأَمْسِكُوهُنَّ بِمَعْرُوفٍ أَوْ سَرِّحُوهُنَّ بِمَعْرُوفٍ, either you hold on to your women with goodness, or you leave them with goodness. The end of that ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهِ وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ, fear Allah and know well that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most knowing about everything that happens. Now, why do I bring this conversation up today? You know, in the world we live in today, relationships have become ultra complicated. Not just between husband and wife, between father and sons, between mother and daughters, between grandparents and grandchildren, between uncles, aunties and nephews and nieces, between employer and employee, between the buyer and seller. In all spaces of society, you find that relationships are overly complicated, such that a term has come about in our times: toxic relationships. Toxic relationships. Why do these toxic relationships come about? They come about for two reasons. The reason number one is because when you leave a human being on his own to function by himself without any sort of higher code of conduct, he's just going to think about himself. And you can't really blame a person, because if he's not attaching that to anything else, his friendship, his marriage, his relationship with his employees, his relationship with his community, neighbors, etc., is just going to revolve around himself and his benefits. Why do I need to check up on my neighbor if I'm okay? If my neighbor hasn't got any food, that's his problem. I've got food, that's okay. And if I give him food, then I'm losing money from my pocket. That's how relationships are viewed today. And the second way it's viewed is when the same thing occurs where a human being doesn't have a code, a higher code to deal with relationships. What happens is that a system or institution comes down and makes sure that all of these relationships are fulfilled by the pen and paper only. Fulfilled by the pen and paper only. Work, again, marriages, friendships, parents and children, everything is done by the pen and paper to such an extent where human beings, they freeze, meaning their soul and spirit has no place in the world anymore. They've now become purely material beings because everything is constituted by the pen and paper, by the courts and the solicitor and by the law and the jury. That's how things are. And when that occurs, you actually have a very broken world. The social fabric of the world is finished, is broken. This is why you see it. But then, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as well as given rights to the husband and wife, even to friends and family and neighbors, you always find one beautiful ingredient Allah places within relationships, which is what? وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ رَبَّكُمْ. Fear Allah, your Lord. And again, in the other ayah in Surah Baqarah, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ, fear Allah. Even in Surah Nisa, what's the beginning of Surah Nisa? يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ اتَّقُوا رَبَّكُمُ الَّذِي خَلَقَكُم مِّن نَفْسٍ وَاحِدَةٍ وَخَلَقَ مِنْهَا زَوْجَهَا. It's until the end of the ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this ayah, He's speaking about how He's made mankind from one soul into pairs, and then from pairs many children. But then from those relationships, how does the ayah begin? يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ اتَّقُوا رَبَّكُمْ. Fear your Lord, or have consciousness of your Lord. Be conscious of your Creator. Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mention this idea in the midst of ayahs to do with relationships and contracts? It's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He wants to elevate the nature of these relationships from a pen and paper and materialistic relationship to a elevated relationship where there's love, understanding and accountability. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, يعني واتقوا الله, or يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم, O mankind, fear your Lord. And this is not just a concept for Muslims just to embody. In fact, this should be a universal concept which can bring about amazing amounts of prosperity in the world. And I'll explain why. Why would Allah tell mankind to have taqwa when it comes to His responsibilities and relationship? You see, when the merchant cheats the buyer, he's not cheating the buyer. He's cheating Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When the spouse is unfaithful to the other spouse, that spouse isn't being unloyal or unfaithful only to the spouse. In greater terms, that spouse is betrayed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because the concept of taqwa is a concept where you are self-monitoring yourself all the time. And on paper, like you saw in these courts that took place with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, you saw that one of them was very eloquent. Somebody can dupe the jury, because like the hadith says, inna fil bayani la sifra, that indeed in speech there's a sense of magic, meaning somebody can be very, very, very good with their words. Somebody could be very silver-tongued. Somebody can have a good command of the language. Somebody may know how to tap into the sentiments of the people. And the other person, miskeen, doesn't know language, but in the sight of Allah, that person was right. But then what does taqwa do? You instill the idea of taqwa in yourself because it's a means to self-monitor yourself. And this idea of self-monitoring does not exist in the Western world at all. At all. From the very, very top, ruling elite of the society today, to when you saw Tottenham riots, when even kids were stealing TVs, walking out of JD with trainers. Why does that exist? Why does this happen in society where people are now frozen and they become materialistic people? They become people whose relationships are constituted just by the pen and paper? Is because when you've taken the idea of taqwa, self-monitoring out of a society, this is what you're going to have. So imagine, dear brothers and sisters, as well as, fellow non-Muslims who are watching this, imagine you have an idea in the 21st century, in the current world we live in today, where relationships are built upon the idea of self-monitoring yourself. Because you know that regardless of how well you speak, regardless of how well you can bring people on your side, regardless of how well you may be able to explain your case or get away with crimes, that doesn't exist in the civilization of Islam, because we know that Allah says no sleep or drowsiness can ever take him. We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the all-watching, all-hearing, all-knowing, and He's the one that will bring people to account. So I mentioned the ayah of divorce today to bring to light the idea of taqwa. And it's not just linked to marriages. This is linked to a wider point of society, the world today, that the social fabric has been completely destroyed and tarnished. It's beyond repair. And it cannot be repaired because there's nothing within the framework of the Western world order which can fix it. Now imagine, like I just said, you have this idea of taqwa, self-monitoring yourself 24/7, regardless of whether there are any cameras, whether you can get away with it. In workplaces, how many times does sexual harassment occur with women? Why does it occur? Because men think they can get away with doing things because no one's looking. But they're wrong. Allah is always watching. People think they can get away with theft. If the alarms aren't working and the workers aren't in that specific area, go ahead, steal and loot as you like to steal and loot. No problem. No one's watching. In the world today, where the genocide is taking place, in Gaza, because they are not accountable to a higher being, all these courts are a waste of time. But the reason why they do this is because they're not accountable to a higher being. But in Islam, the rulers that we had in the past, in our previous caliphates and civilizations, rulers would never ever get away with doing this. Not because they couldn't. They perhaps could have done so easily. But it's because they knew that their relationship with their people is tied with the concept of taqwa. So they were always self-monitoring themselves. All good is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I pray this idea was very clear. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enable us to establish our relationships purely on taqwa. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enable us to also push forward and propagate this idea of taqwa and relationships within society. All good is from Allah, all bad is from myself. Please overlook my shortcomings, and inshallah I'll see you for another episode tomorrow. Until then, barakallahu feekum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
بصوت وخيل فما لك في الأرض در